Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question today, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. You'll then be prompted to record your first and last name. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objection, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host, Ms. Melissa Grosso. Thank you. You may begin.
Great. Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to those on the call. We're pleased to have you all back for another webinar in our 17-part series. This is another 201 series, so hopefully all of the folks on the call have a good grasp of the basics of export compliance and specifically the basics of the BIS regulations. Today's webinar is on license exceptions. As you've heard from me before, I'm with the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the export promotion arm under the U.S. Department of Commerce. You've seen this information before, but just a reminder that if you have any international related questions in terms of trade promotion and exporting, feel free to reach out to your local specialist, and you can look up who your local specialist is on our website, which is www.export.gov. Again, another reminder that we have a couple more webinars coming up for the balance of this week and running into about mid-August. So if you haven't signed up for those, definitely encourage you to take a look at our website and sign up for those. As we've done with previous webinars, we will have a Q&A session that will take place after the presentations are completed, and definitely encourage you to either ask an audio question, or on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a written Q&A section. So feel free to ask a bunch of questions during today's call. Very pleased, again, to have two wonderful speakers from the U.S. Department of Commerce's BIS office. We have Stephen Hall, who is an Export Administration Regulations Specialist, and we also have Timothy Mooney, who is a Senior Export Policy Analyst with the Regulatory Policy Division under BIS. So thank you again, Stephen and Tim, for being with us, and look forward to your presentation. Stephen, you should have control of the slides.
Okay.
Just give it a couple more seconds, Stephen. There seems to be a little delay in passing the presenter privileges. Stephen, I'm going to recommend that you begin the presentation and give me an audio cue to move the slides. There seems to be a slight technical delay.
Okay, very good.
Things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Melissa, and welcome to those listening on by phone for this webinar on license exception. Last time we were pleased to give you an overview and in-depth analysis of some of the parts of the Export Administration regulations, and we plan to do the same here by giving a sort of an advanced look at some of the particular requirements under license exception. My colleague Tim Mooney here will dwell primarily in a lot of the detail work, the new detail work that we frequently get questions on some license exceptions, especially in regards to the 600 series or those items that have come over to us for license processing from the U.S. Department of State. So this afternoon we're going to be looking at license exceptions, and these are a very unique part of our regulations. They are, in fact, an area where if you have found in the processing of determining if you need a license and going through all the steps involved, the sort of the order of review, to determine if a license that you are needing an export license, and you find that in the Commerce Country Chart that there is an X in the box, that you will need to have, there's a possibility that you could still use a license exception to not go ahead and get an export license. This is a perfectly legal area to deal with. It is an area that we recommend to many companies, but many companies are not aware of the many license exceptions that they could indeed be qualified for.
And Stephen, excuse the interruption, you should have control of the slides now.
Okay. Melissa, I'm sorry, we're having difficulty on this end on the advancement of it.
Okay, then I'll continue to advance them.
Okay, so we are on what is a license exception. It's part 740. The license exception is indeed an authorization to export, re-export, or transfer a product without requiring to get an export license from us. The license exceptions are typically consists of 3 letters, depending on how it is to be used. In some cases, it requires notification, review, or support. But in order as to use this, there are certain caveats that you need to follow. On the slide that says following steps to determine if a license exception is needed or available, we find that in the different steps, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, that there are certain requirements, if you do qualify for it, that you need to understand and to be using it for. Obviously, we need to find out if you are eligible to be having this license exception. Please note that under 740.2 of the Export Administration Act of regulations is that lays the groundwork that you must follow if you plan to use any, and I repeat, any of our license exceptions. You must at least meet the qualifications of 740.2. Thank you. We're able to see the slides at this time. So when you can't use a license exception 740.2, when we have it there, is in your area if you've been suspended or revoked your authorization, a general prohibition that is there, surreptitious interception devices, crime control technology, missile technology, embargoed nations in most instances. These are the very basic ones, and you need as a general practice to indeed become familiar with 740.2 as a prerequisite to use any of our license exceptions that we have here. We're going to be looking at in detail with some of the more popular ones that are in our license exceptions, namely in our STA and the RPL, which is the repair, and TNP, which is temporary exports. But I wanted to at least give you some idea as to some of the other licenses that are out there that a lot of people are not always aware of. For example, if we take a look at what we call list-based exemptions, these are items, exemptions that you can use if you have a specific product in mind. For example, if we look in the Export Administration Regulations under 6A004 for optical equipment and components, and if we look under that category, you will find the license requirements, the reasons for control, that is why we control the particular product, and that's say for national security or anti-terrorism or regional stability. And it will tell you the categories that we may have under national security to use at the Commerce Country Chart. But you will also find there that if you indeed see that in looking at the reasons control and looking at the country chart that yes, an X is there for my product, well, we urge you to take a look a little bit further down as to the list-based license exceptions. And there it notes that all of our license exceptions are detailed in Part 740 of the Export Administration Regulations. So we urge you to, if you find that you are qualified for license exceptions, to confer not only with 740.2, but with the category of 740 and the specific sections within your area. Under 740.2, you'll also notice it restricts licenses to certain destinations that we have of Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Crimea region, and based in certain cases in Russia there, unless a license exception is specifically granted in this regard. Okay, so what we want to look at here is some of those list-based license exceptions. And as we looked at 6A004, we found that, yes, if you find that there's an X in the box for your country and your specific section under 6A004, let's say 6A004.A.1, that, and you find that there's an X in the box if you're selling it to a certain country, well, you can take a look back at the list-based license exceptions part there under 6A004 and discover that you can indeed send, under certain requirements, a product overseas without having to come to us to get a license. For example, when we look at 6A004 and we look under list-based license exemptions, we'll find that LVS, or limited value shipments, can be made of the value of $3,000 or less. And this can be done on this is very popular if you are, for example, sending a sample item over for review or inspection, and it will remain there. So you could, if your product is under 6A004 and is of $2,500, and it is not going to one of the sanctioned countries or the embargoed countries or the individuals or organizations in our consolidated screening list, then you may be able to export it there. Again, as with all these others, please look at the LVS category in Part 740 for further details on it. Consequently, we also find that GBS, which is a product that will be going to certain countries too, will require also are pertained to a license exception too. And when we
excuse me, Stephen, could you please clarify which slide you're on?
I'm on no slide. I'm still on slide 740.2.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm still on that slide. So when we take a look at that product, specifically exemption, is for those categories that apply for the GBS categories, country group B specifically. And you take a look in the country group, which is in that category 740 and supplement there, and finding out if your country is on there. Now, typically these countries are friendly countries. Western Europe, for example, would be there. And if your product is indeed 6A004.A.1, that yes, if you are qualified to use GBS. Again, please look again at the citation for GBS in Part 740 for fuller information and following up on those qualifications in using that. If you'll notice, the GBS is applicable for 6A004.A1, A2, A4, Category B, and D2. So if you had D1 and it was going to one of the categories in the B category, it would not be applicable in that regard. You'll also find out that under list-based license exceptions for 6A004 that there is a category called CIV. CIV is for civil end users. And if it has that notation, yes, then you are qualified for that product if you are, let's say, 6A004.A1 and A2, A4, B, and D2. Now, civil end users are for country group D1, except for North Korea. Items that require a license for ultimate destination are for national security only. So please make that in mind. It's for national security reasons only. They must be for civil end users and end use. Obviously, no military or proliferation end users on the lead. And again, in order to qualify for this, as well as the other list-based license exceptions, it must be stated there in the category itself and having yes as well, with the exception of obviously LVS, limited value shipments, which has the actual statement there too. Just getting back to limited value shipments as well, when you take a look at that, it's 740.3. It does deal with commodities in Group B. itself. It's commodities itself, not technology. You cannot exceed the LVS value limit on that. And we do have an annual valuation restriction. That is 12 times the LVS value, the same ECCN going to the same consignee itself. So we have the requirements there. We'll be talking about some of the other ones that are popular with us in terms of technology and technology software systems itself. This gives you a brief overview of the most common ones. There are some other ones that you can be aware of. For example, like BAG is a common one. This is an item where you actually are taking it with you. Again, looking at the considerations for BAG, GFT, and others. Take a look at the specific citation for that in Part 740. What we want to do at this time is to go a little bit more in depth on the use of our license exceptions, specifically in the area of our sanction destination. If I could have the next, we'll have the next slide up for, please. And with that, when we start going into the sanction destinations itself, we will want to take a look at these categories, these countries itself. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tim Mooney, to describe this and the STA and the 600 series itself. Thank you. Tim.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so there's a lot of criteria that goes along with using our license exceptions. In an hour and a half presentation, we're not going to be able to go through every twist and turn, with the various license exceptions. So we want to, if we can go back, actually, two slides, just for a second. Yeah. So as Steve mentioned, essentially, you're not going to see this in the regulations, but essentially, effectively using our license exceptions in accordance with the AR, you're going to follow 6 steps. The first step, you need to make sure that you have the jurisdiction right of the item that you're looking at. I mean, that's kind of a prerequisite to looking at the Export Administration regulations. And then once you determine that the item is, in fact, subject to the AR, then you're going to go through the steps of classification and then looking to see whether it actually requires a license. And you'd be surprised how many people call us or send us an email and they've skipped that step too. They're just immediately looking for a license exception. And if they had gone through, the step 2 analysis, they would have actually determined, well, I'm sending this to Canada. I actually don't require an authorization to send that to Canada in this scenario, or to the UK or to Australia. So that's an important, step. Is it actually subject to a license requirement? And depending on what the license requirement is based off of, that may actually knock you out of being able to look at license exceptions, right from the outset. For example, if it's a prescribed party on the entity list, in most cases you're not going to be able to use a license exception to overcome that license requirement. Or if somebody from North Korea contacts you and says, we want assistance in helping us develop our missile program, obviously you're not going to be able to use a license exception for that type of an activity. So, what's driving the license requirement? In certain cases, you're going to knock out certain license exceptions. And then as Steve just went over, once you determine that you're subject to a license requirement, so if you think in terms of the EAR, you're either outside of the scope of the license requirements or you're inside the scope of the license requirements. So if it's outside of license requirements, then you can just use the designation no license required. And if you think in terms of dealing with a live wire, so at your house you're trying to install a new outlet or something like that, if it's not a live wire, you don't really need to be that concerned with the transaction. Even if you don't do it correctly, you're not going to usually have an issue initially. With a live wire, you could potentially get hurt, or others could potentially get hurt, and that's when you have a license requirement under the EAR. You should really think of that as you're dealing with a live wire. Under certain criteria, we don't want you to come in for a license. And this is a very important part of how we do things under the EAR, because in terms of our jurisdiction, extremely broad in terms of, what requires is subject to the EAR. A lot of that is just going to simply be outside of the scope of the license requirements. But then a lot of the transactions that are subject to a license requirement, what we do under the EAR is we have these stated authorizations with specified criteria, and if you meet that specified criteria, we want you to use those authorizations to authorize those. Now, in certain cases like license exception STA, we give you the option whether you want to use STA or come in for the license exception. But in general, those license exceptions play a very important role in terms of the overall efficiency for you as an exporter, re-exporter, or transfer to be able to manage your transactions in an efficient manner, and also for the U.S. government to say that, for these transactions, if they check, all 6 of these criteria, we don't, in 100% of the cases, we don't need to see an individual validated license application for those. So once you determine a license required, you can go to the step 3. In step 3, you're looking at the list-based license exceptions. These tend to be simpler, shorter, but there's an additional step before you can use a list-based license exception, and you need to look at the ECCN entry, and there's a license exception section, and you would need to see that list-based license exception identified, and it would need to say yes. Steve went over LVS, for example, for limited value shipments. It would have to say LVS yes, and then there would be a dollar value. Or it may say LVS not applicable. Now, you're not going to see all of the list-based license exceptions listed in any ECCN, and the reason why is some of the list-based license exceptions are specific to commodities. Some of them are specific to software or technology. So you only see those list-based license exceptions where they may potentially be applicable to a list-based license exception. Now, I want to emphasize this. License exception STA is not, I repeat, is not a list-based license exception. It causes a lot of confusion for people because they think that because certain ECCNs include a special conditions for STA section, that they're thinking of STA as a list-based license exception. It absolutely is not. What those special conditions for STA sections are basically doing is providing additional requirements and sometimes kickouts from what's eligible for STA. But unlike a list-based license exception, you don't necessarily have to see STA yes to be able to use that. But in certain cases, it may knock out certain country groups or certain items it may knock out. So as you're doing your analysis, whether you can use license exception, you're looking at the list-based license exceptions. If STA is one that you're going to potentially look at, you're looking at a special conditions for STA section, if that ECCN has it, seeing if you're knocked out there. And then at that point, then you're going to do that critical step where you're going to go to step 5. We're going to look at those general restrictions. The list-based license exceptions, you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking, well, I see it says LVS yes, then I can use LVS. Or it says GBS yes, then I can automatically use it. No, that's just checking the box for that prerequisite step. Then you're going to 740.2. And this is a critical step because if you don't go to 740.2, you may very well get the wrong answer whether you can use a license exception or not. 740.2 plays a critical role for us where we knock out certain items or put additional restrictions in terms of what license exceptions you can use. Steve went over the MT items, the crime control items where this plays a very important role. The sanctioned destinations under Part 746, your Irans, your Syrias, your North Koreas. We use under 740.2 paragraph A6, we say that you can't use a license exception unless it's specifically called out in Part 746. For the military and the spacecraft related items, the whole framework of how we did the license exceptions is directly tied to 740.2. And the way that we did it is we basically did it through negation. So we said if it's a 600 series item or a spacecraft-related item in 9X515, if it's going to a country group D5 country, a country that would be subject to a U.S. arms embargo under country group D5, as well as 126.1 of the State Department's controls, you can't use license exceptions for the military items or the spacecraft-related items, except for the United States government authorization under GOV, and then for some certain protective equipment, we have some TMP and BAG eligibility. But otherwise than that, if it's going to one of those U.S. arms embargo countries, we're we're knocking out the ability to use any license exception for those except for the specific ones that are identified there. And then we have the non-country group D5 countries, all the other countries of the world, where we have a paragraph A13, where again, the same structure that we have for the D5 countries, where we're saying you can't use a license exception for the 600 series, and the spacecraft items aren't called out in A13, so that means that you may have more license exceptions that may be available for the non-D5 countries. But for the 600 series, similar structure where we're saying that you can't use license exceptions except for the specific license exceptions that are identified there. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of following the correct steps. Determine jurisdiction, determining whether a license is required, looking whether a list-based license exception may be available or not. If you're looking at STA, make sure you look at those special conditions for STA, and then looking at those general restrictions in 740.2. If you skip 740.2 in particular, you may go to look at one of our license exceptions, and you're saying, well, can I use this for Iran? Well, in certain cases, you may see the E1 country specifically carved out of a license exception, but the criteria in the license exceptions in many cases is taking into account that you've already looked at 740.2. So you may, if you look at a license exception, you might say, oh, I could use that for Iran. Well, no. If you had looked at 740.2 and then you had looked at the Iran section in Part 746, you would see under paragraph C it says no ER license exceptions are available for Iran. And the reason why is because the primary licensing agency for the U.S. government is the Treasury Department. That's why we basically carve out all the license exceptions. But again, the importance of the steps. Now, once you look at 740.2, then you're going to say, well, what license exceptions may potentially be available? You may have identified some list-based license exceptions that may potentially be available, or based on the type of transaction that's going to a foreign government, it's a temporary transaction, you've already exported this item to somebody under a license, now you need to send some one-for-one replacement parts or components, you may have an idea of some transaction-based license exceptions that may potentially be available. Now, at that point, then you're looking at the specific criteria under the section for the license exception that you want to use, and then making sure that you check off all the criteria that may be applicable. You may have to meet, 5 conditions, and there may be 2 or 3 exclusions that you also need to take into account. But the key thing is looking at that license exception and making sure that you can meet all of the applicable criteria. Some of the list-based license exceptions are fairly short, in one single authorization that you're looking at in terms of the paragraph authorization. Others are these very broad authorizations like license exception TMP, which has about 23 or 24 separate paragraphs authorizing different types of temporary exports, re-exports, or transfers in country. And the key to that is just make sure you're looking very carefully what's the paragraph that you're using, and then can you meet all of the applicable criteria. So if we can transition to the next slide. And as we talked about, the importance of 740.2 under that step 5 for looking at the general restrictions. For 740.2 A6, that's where we knock out the use of license exceptions for those embargoed destinations from Part 746, unless you go to Part 746 and you see one of those specific license exceptions identified. We can go to the next slide. And then here's the license exceptions paragraph. Now, actually, I left off on Syria. It should have been 746.9 paragraph B for Syria. But essentially what you're doing, so if you're going to Cuba, if you're going to North Korea, Syria, you're looking at the license exceptions paragraph, seeing do you see that specific license exception that you may want to use. Now, keep in mind that some of the license exceptions, in many cases, it may be limited to certain specific paragraphs under those ER license exceptions. And then those are the only paragraphs that would potentially be eligible for North Korea or for Syria. Now, again, you can't stop there. You would need to go look at that specific license exception, those specific paragraphs under that license exception that were identified as being potentially available under Part 746. And then once you determine that you meet all of that criteria, then you can use that as the authorization. BS does have on our website, we have FAQs available on the BS website for the sanctioned destinations. For Cuba, for example, we have some 7 questions that we added recently, providing some additional guidance, on Cuba. We can progress to the next slide. Great. So now making a clean break. Now we're going to talk about the 600 series and the 9X515 ECCNs. So all of those countries which are in Part 746, your Irans, your North Koreas, your Syrias, your Cubas, they're all in country group D5. So those countries, would generally be carved out, for the 600 series as well as the 9X515s because of the restriction under 740.2 paragraph A12, except in some very, very limited cases, like for the United States government. So we've completed talking about the sanction destination. Now we're going to change our focus to the military items under the 600 series as well as the 9X515 items. Now we're going to put the emphasis on these items that have moved over, but a lot of what we're going to talk about also has applicability to other items that are subject to the air. So where it's relevant, I'll also hit on those too. As we talked about for the military items as well as spacecraft-related items, 740.2 plays a very important role under A12 for the D5 U.S. arms embargo countries as well as the non-D5 countries under paragraph A13. Next slide. So A12, these, we've already gone over this, the D5 countries, these are U.S. arms embargoed countries, very limited in terms of what license exceptions are available. Generally, it's going to be limited to the United States government authorization for the 600 series as well as the 9X515 spacecraft-related items. And then for the personal protective equipment that moved over under 1A613 paragraph C or D, we added some specific paragraphs under TMP under A11 as well as BAG for the personal baggage under paragraph H2. The distinction between TMP, the company owns it, versus the BAG, where it's your personal baggage that you're bringing. So if you own the personal protective equipment that you're bringing, then you're looking at BAG. If it's the company sending you on an assignment, they're giving you personal protective equipment. It's nice that they're giving you the personal protective equipment, but probably not sending you to the safest place. But TMP is what you're looking at in that case. The next slide. But the heart of really what we're doing with the military items is, and where we really want to facilitate with our license exceptions, this is really one of the key reasons why we brought items over from the State Department's international traffic and arms regulations for the items that were determined under the review process, interagency review process, to no longer warrant ITAR control. Those items were moved over to the ER controls, and one of the benefits of moving those items over was that we had the ability to use some of our existing license exceptions as well as broaden some of our license exceptions or create new license exceptions to more efficiently authorize these two countries that we wanted to increase interoperability with. And this paragraph A13 that identifies the exhaustive listing for the 600 series. As I mentioned, the 9X515s are not called out in 740.2 A13. So a little bit broader in terms of the license exceptions that are available for the spacecraft-related items compared to the 600 series, but it is a fairly good list of license exceptions that are going to be available there to assist you in authorizing your transactions. We also have, in addition to A13, for the 600 series major defense equipment, we have limitations under A15 and A16, but the items that we've received, for the 600 series major defense equipment, it's a very small set of items that have come over, so very little activity there, but that would be another additional restriction that you'd look at as you made a determination whether you could use a license exception. Next slide. So now talking about the license exceptions for the 600 series that are available for the non-D5 countries. As Steve went over, the LVS that's available for other ECCNs as well as the 600 series. Generally, it's going to be set at $1,500 for most 600 series. This is limited to commodity ECCNs. So if you're looking at a software technology ECCN, you're never going to see LVS because it's just not applicable. And that's a good point that under the AR, when we say items, that's basically capturing, the whole universe, commodities, software, and technology. But when we want to be more specific under the year, we'll call out commodities or we'll call out, software and technology. License exceptions are a very good example of that. So in LBS, when we say it authorizes commodities, you know that, if you have software or technology, that's not a license exception that's going to potentially help you. But if you have commodities, that's one that you could potentially look at. License exception TMP, as I said, a lot of different things can be authorized under license exception TMP. Anytime you have a transaction where you're sending something outside the United States temporarily, something comes into the United States, you want to send that back out. That came in temporarily in the United States, you want to send that back out. If you're doing beta test software and you're temporarily sending outside the United States for software and testing, it's going to be destroyed at the end of the test or it's coming back. TMP is, the logical one that you're looking to. RPL plays a very important role under the EAR in terms of the efficiency of the system. If somebody's buying an expensive machine tool, for example, if they had to come in for a license for that, they may be fine coming in for the license, but if that machine tool goes down and they need a replacement part, within the next 24 hours to get that machine tool back up so their line isn't not functioning for a week or for a month while you're coming to get a license, that's definitely, something that, would deter people from wanting to buy items that were subject to the EAR. So that's where we have licenses, but then we also have, under license exception RPL, we have the one-for-one replacement parts and components, as well as the return of repaired or replaced items. So it plays a very important role under the EAR. Again, there's specific criteria that goes along with that, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But, some of the key things, you can't enhance the item that you, originally sent out. The item that you're sending the one-for-one replacement part, would have need to have been done in accordance with U.S. export controls, et cetera. License exception GOV, if you're going to the United States government or you're exporting something on behalf of the United States government, license exception GOV is going to help you in many cases. There's also provisions for cooperating governments as well as NATO agencies they use for military purposes. And for the NATO agencies, regardless of territorial location. So if you're going to NATO, that's definitely a good one to potentially look to. And can you advance to the next slide? License exception TSU. This is identified in 740.13, in section 740.2813. However, with TSU, just keep in mind, similar to STA, only certain paragraphs under TSU are available for the 600 series. So those are the only ones that you're going to be looking to, the paragraph A, B, F, and G. BAG, as we talked about, limited to certain personal protective equipment with U.S. persons, baggage, or effects. The personal protective equipment, that's one of the ones that's also available under that BAG, including for the U.S. arms embargoed countries. STA, that plays a very important role. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but if it's going to a country group A5 country, STA in many cases is going to allow you to not have to come in for an individual validated license. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a couple moments. And the next slide. So license TMP authorizes temporary imports, exports, re-exports, or transfers. As part of the initial implementation of the reform effort, we did some reorganization of license exception TMP. It's still a fairly complicated license exception because there's a lot of different authorizations, like we talked about, tucked into one license exception. And essentially it breaks into three kind of broad authorizations and then various sub-authorizations under there. Under the paragraph A, B, and C. The paragraph A has the tools of trade provisions. So if you're sending your employee outside of the United States and they need certain items that they're going to be bringing with them, they're going to maintain effective control of it. Those tools of trade are coming back. At the end of it, TMP would be the logical one that you're going to look to. We broadened a number of years ago to add technology by U.S. persons under license exception TMP. Exhibition, demonstration, personal protective equipment, U.S. facilities, affiliates, kits of replacement parts, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, how TMP lines up with RPL. We get a lot of questions on that. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Inspection, calibration, that's another one that kind of lines up with license exception RPL. something comes temporarily into the United States, the return of foreign origin items, items that are just in transit to the United States, demos, exhibitions, it comes in for a trade show in the United States, you want to send it back out, TMP under that paragraph B is what you're going to be looking to, and again, the beta test software. You can't use TMP, though, to two-step your way outside of the United States. So if you know, for example, at the time that you're exporting it, that you're not sending that out for a temporary export, you know that you're sending it out for a permanent export, you have no business looking at TMP in that case. So that's going to take you outside of the scope of TMP. Now, you send it to TMP, through TMP to a trade show, and somebody at the trade show says, this is great, I want to buy, 100,000 of these units, and I like it so much, I want to buy, this display unit that you're displaying, at the trade show. Well, things like that happen, and, provided there was another authorization or an authorization wasn't required. So say, for example, you went to Singapore, and there was a Canadian company was there, and the Canadian company saw it, and they said, well, this is fantastic. We want to buy, 100,000 units of these. We want to buy it at the trade show, and we're going to bring it back to us to Canada. Well, it required an authorization to go to Singapore, so you use TMP to get to Singapore, but it doesn't actually require an authorization to be permanently re-exported to Canada, so the Canadians could actually take it back NLR. Or if it was another authorization was available, for example, to go from Singapore to another party, you could do that also.
Let me just mention one thing on here, Tim, for the listeners. We get an awful lot of calls, and if you're involved in export compliance at your company, really look at TMP. The kinds of calls we oftentimes get is we're going to the Paris Air Show or Farnborough Air Show or a large event in another country, and it's the business development people say, we've got the mock-ups here, we've got the materials going out for it, we're ready to ship, aren't we? Oftentimes, you may need a license for that, but because it's going to a trade event and trade show, you as an export compliance person with those responsibilities, take a look at TMP. It could very well be that you could indeed send it right away without getting the license, and what that means is that you don't have to wait your 30-some days or 30, 40 days that you normally would if you had a license for it. So you could ship those things right away. Again, take a look at the requirements of TMP under 740.9. Another question we get is, Tim, we oftentimes have like how long is a duration for TMP? Typically, it's 1 year's time that it must be that it could be overseas before it comes here. Oftentimes, also, people will be using TMP in conjunction with a carnet. If they're doing several demonstrations in several countries overseas, in which you go to a number of different areas, they'll oftentimes look at a carnet, which is primarily like a passport for goods, but it does mean that you're not paying the duty rates that would be typically assessed on these kind of things. So take a look at TMP, especially if you're looking at that area of exhibitions and demonstrations that will be had there. Okay.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. We can progress to the next slide.
Yeah.
So as we went over, generally no later than 1 year, except for paragraph A8 and A11 from the date of export, re-export, or transfer in country. And again, you can use license exceptions to authorize a transfer in country. Primarily where that's going to come into play is, for example, if something goes out under a license. And say, for example, it goes to the UK, it goes out under a license, and then you want to transfer it in country to for example, an American company, an aerospace company has a support and repair facility in the UK. And you want to transfer the item that you had received from that U.S. company in the UK for repair and servicing, you could actually use license exception TMP to temporarily transfer it to that U.S. company for the servicing and repair in the UK, and then for the return of that item in the UK, the U.S. company in the UK could actually use RPL in that case. So you can't use license exceptions generally to authorize a transfer in country. And the key deal there is, if it would authorize a re-export, it would also, authorize a transfer in country. We talked about, in certain cases, you may send it out thinking it was going to go out temporarily, but then things change. You would look at A14, Roman numeral 1, 2, or 3, and you need to basically fit under one of those. And, permanent export, re-export, or transfer in country, except as permitted by this or other applicable provision of the year, such as another license exception, use of existing license, or apply for a license 90 days prior to expiration, which can authorize up to an additional 4 years. We've had some people, for example, like with TMP, went out under TMP, and then they wanted to, permanently transfer it in country or permanently keep it outside of the United States, and it was in the UK or it was in France, and they actually met all of the criteria to use license exception STA, and they said, well, can we use STA in that case? And yes, they could use under A14 Roman numeral I, provided that they met all the criteria of STA, that would be fine to authorize the permanent export, re-export, or transfer in country under using STA or some other license exception. Okay, the next slide. And RPL, as we talked about, this is a very important license exception under the air. It breaks down into, really these two key authorizations: the one-for-one replacement parts, components, accessories, or attachments. Allows 600 series parts or components to repair ER or ITAR items under certain conditions. Now, it doesn't actually authorize ITAR items. That's a very important thing. But because a lot of the end item weapons platforms are still back on the ITAR, in the 600 series, in many cases, are the parts of the components that go into those ITAR items. You may be sending a one-for-one replacement part to repair an ITAR, a defense article that was authorized under the ITAR, which may have included, authorizing the parts or components that were incorporated at the time of export from the United States that were 600 series, and that's fine to use RPL in that case to authorize those one-for-one replacements of the ER 600 series items going to authorize repair, those defense articles that were originally authorized under the ITAR. Servicing or replacement of commodities and software. Servicing of commodities and software sent to the U.S. or a foreign party. It can include replacements for defective or unacceptable ER equipment. There are special record keeping for 600 series and certain ECCNs, like the explosive detection equipment that you'd need to keep in mind. And the key thing is, Steve had mentioned earlier, no enhancements. Now, in certain cases, it was originally exported out 10 years ago. You may not make that exact configuration of that part or that component. In the version that you have, it is going to change the characteristics of the original item. In those cases, you're not going to be able to use RPL. Don't try to fit it into RPL. You'd have to come in for a license if no other authorization was available. But definitely in the license application, you should explain, either a letter of explanation or a Block 24, well, we would have used RPL because, this is essentially one-for-one replacement part or component, but it is going to enhance these capabilities, and then list out exactly how it would change it. Now, in certain cases, they may look at it and say, we don't think that actually is sufficient to knock you out of RPL, and they may RWA that back and say you can use RPL in that case. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to make that determination yourself. And even if they do process the license, hopefully they'll take that into account when they look at that license also. And the key thing, too, is, the original export or re-export or transfer in country, it needs to have been done in accordance, with the U.S. export control system. So if the item was involved with a violation, obviously we're not going to use RPL to, help somebody, keep that item up functioning. You kind of think of the example of somebody stole your car and they contacted you later, how to program the CD player. You're not going to tell them, how to do that. And the same thing with RPL. It's based on the fact that that item, originally was authorized under the U.S. export control system, either under the EAR or in the case of, defense articles under the ITAR that included ER items. that was done in accordance, with the regulations. And former Secretary of Defense Gates, he gave a very good example at the beginning of the reform initiative, where he gave the example of a C-130, which had been basically authorized under the State Department's controls, and that C-130 was actually in theater, with the U.S. military, fighting with us side by side, and it was basically had to go back to Australia, and it was sitting on the ground, an aircraft on the ground. That C-130 was sitting on the ground while the Australian government had to go back to the State Department to basically get a license to send replacement parts and components. Now, obviously, the U.S. government, moved that license through the system extremely quickly, but license exception RTL, they would not even need to apply for a license. They could ship that as soon as they got that need. They looked at 740.2, made sure there wasn't an issue there. They looked at RPL. They could send that, within 30 minutes. They could do that analysis and have that replacement part or component out the door. And it's available for exports as well as re-exports. So if they had the replacement parts, for example, in another facility in Australia, maybe they could have it in there in a couple hours, or if it was, a repair facility located in Japan or Singapore, within a couple hours flight, they could have it there. So a much more efficient way for authorizing those types of things where the U.S. government has an interest in facilitating those types of transactions. Next slide. So we get a lot of questions, particularly for people that had moved over from the State Department's controls, and even for people that have been doing this for a long time, how these different license exceptions work together, in particular license exceptions TMP, RPL, and then for items that are subject to the EAR, there's no authorization requirement under the EAR. That is the substantive difference between the EAR versus the ITAR. So things coming into the United States, you don't actually require an authorization under the EAR. So under this example, one, we have machine tool sent from Germany for servicing repair in the United States. No authorization is required under the EAR. Under step two, the company in the U.S. services and repairs the item, which may include new parts and components, but no enhancements, and then uses RPL to send that item back to Germany. So import in the United States, repair and servicing by the U.S. company, and then they send it back, to their person that purchased the machine tool using RPL. Example two in the next slide. So here it's going to be a re-export to Italy. So the same scenario, but now it's a re-export to Italy under TMP and return under license exception RPL. So the machine tool was sent from Germany for servicing and repair in Italy. So TMP is used under 740.9 paragraph A6. That's what's used to re-export the machine tool from Germany for servicing in Italy. And then after that servicing is done and repair is done in Italy, then they're using RPL as the authorization to send it back to Germany. So those two license exceptions, working hand in hand. Right, now we do have TMP and RPL. There are certain VOSNAR reporting requirements in 740.31, but for the 600 series as well as the spacecraft-related items, none of those items are identified in 743.1, so there's no special reporting requirements at this time for any of the 600 series or 9X515 items for TMP and RPL. We do have 743.4, and those are for conventional arms reporting. However, that's just a placeholder currently. There's no actual 600 series items identified there. So although that could potentially be applicable, it's just basically a placeholder at this time, so don't worry about that. Next slide. License exception GOV, as I had mentioned, if you're exporting something to the United States government, or if the U.S. government's the party that's actually making the export, or if you're exporting something on behalf of the United States government, in particular if it's a DoD-directed shipment, license exception GOV may be available to authorize those transactions. And we did broaden this. Prior, the question, if you wanted to use the United States government authorization under GOV, the question always was, is the item consigned to and for the official use of the U.S. government? Those provisions are still there under 740.2 paragraph B2 Roman numeral 2, but we broadened that paragraph B2 Roman numeral 2 to include contract support personnel, and then also to broaden it if the U.S. government is exporting on behalf of a cooperative program. But then we also broadened, and this was new under the EAR, to add a paragraph B2 Roman numeral 3, 4, and 5. So certain cases where you have somebody, for example, they're running the motor pool for the U.S. military or for USAID. They're receiving items under a contract in Afghanistan, for example. They have a contract with USAID or for the U.S. military to be servicing vehicles. They're only using those parts that they're receiving those parts under license accepted GOV for servicing those vehicles. It's not being consigned to the U.S. government initially. It's going to this contractor who's basically servicing these vehicles for the U.S. military or for USAID or some other U.S. government agency. The broad United States government authorization allows those types of transactions. Now, again, each paragraph has specific criteria that needs to be met. So it can be very useful, in certain situations, particularly if you're doing something for the U.S. government, but you just need to make sure that you meet the specific criteria. The broadest authorizations under GOV, the DoD-directed shipments, and again, the focus on, the national security objectives, in particular for interoperability for the Department of Defense, we give them the broadest discretion in terms of, in particular, the paragraph B2 Roman numeral 4 for those DoD-directed shipments. If DoD has an official directive to you saying we need you to send this to this country, pretty broad in terms of what can be authorized under that. Agencies of cooperating governments, their diplomatic and consular missions. This is existing provisions under GOV. We also added NATO provisions, which isn't limited by territorial restrictions if it's going to a NATO agency. 600 series are limited, though, to country group A5 countries. And then we also have some provisions which are specific to IEA, also the OPCW for some of the chemical weapons stuff, and then also the International Space Station. There's a specific authorization there for the International Space Station. Okay, and the next slide. So license exception STA, as we talked about, as you go through your analysis, you're going to determine whether or not a license exception may be available. In a lot of cases, if you apply for a license and it's available for a license exception like GBS, 9 times out of 10, they're going to probably RWA that back to you and say just use the license exception, or ask you why you're not using a license exception. License exception STA, though, we do give people the option of whether they want to use STA or whether they want to use a license. We definitely encourage you, though, to use license STA when it is available. It's a much more efficient way to authorize a transaction. Keep in mind when you apply for a license, you're limited to what's in that license. It's going to be limited by quantity. It's going to be limited by end use. It's going to be limited by the destinations where it's going to, and then the additional terms and conditions that they place on that. There's going to be a certain validity date for that, generally set at 4 years. Sometimes that can be set longer if you request it. But there's a lot of requirements that go along with using a license. And once you get that license, you can't make any change to that license. The only changes that you can make is a change that's identified in Section 750.7C1. Those are the only changes that you can make for a license transaction. We do have, for certain non-material name changes, like for changes in name for branding purposes, under 750.C2, we have a process where we can come in for an advisory opinion, and if we determine that that's eligible based on the criteria in 750.7C2, we can authorize a name change. But if you want to add a new party to that license, if you want to change the quantity that's on that license, we have some limited shipping tolerance provisions in terms of a 10% dollar value, but in terms of the actual number of machine tools that are authorized, you can't make any changes to that license. So, just keep that in mind. If you prefer to apply for a license, the license, you have to stay within the scope of that license. STA, is not going to be limited by the dollar value. It's not going to be limited by a certain time period. you don't have to wait. If you get an order today from somebody in the UK and they want, $100 million worth of 600 series items or some other item that's eligible for STA, you could authorize that under STA today, this afternoon, before the end of the business day. They need to provide the prior consignee statement, and you would need to, go through the steps of making sure that you're meeting all of the criteria. And then when you exported that out, you'd have to inform that you're using STA as the authorization. But you can do that, in an afternoon. You can do that, within a half an hour if you move quickly. So STA, some of the key things to keep in mind, must be allowed for the specific ECCN, review limitations under 740.20B2 and applicable ECCN for those special conditions for STA sections. As I talked about, though, STA is not a list-based license exception, so you're not looking for an STA yes, but you do need to look at the ECCN, the special conditions for the STA sections. Keep in mind that the ECCNs that's going to be eligible, it can only overcome 6 reasons for control. So if it's an MT control that's placed on that item, you're not going to be able to use STA under paragraph C1 or C2 to overcome that authorization. And STA has 2 separate paragraphs authorizing C1, which is available for the 600 series and the spacecraft-related items, and then we have a C2 for 8 additional destinations that can overcome the national security-controlled items only. But the C1 paragraph for the 600 series as well as the 9X515 spacecraft-related items that can overcome 6 reasons for control for national security, chemical, biological, nuclear proliferation, regional stability, crime control, as well as SI. So very broad in terms of that. Now, there are certain ECCNs that have specific restrictions, like, for example, the hot section technology, in 9E610, there's certain limitations. What can be authorized under STA. For the chemical biological items, for some of the legacy items, there's some specific restrictions that go along with that. But in general, those 6 reasons for control, it can overcome those reasons for control. We did not do a specific form for the prior consignee statement, but we did do a template based on requests that we got from the public. There's a template on the BS website for the 600 series as well as the 9X515 or other items. Your consignee outside the United States, they can copy and paste that, put it on their letterhead, print it out, and sign it, and they can use that as the prior consignee statement. And that would meet up with our requirements. Next slide. Great. And these are just the elements, the 6 points that need to be included in that. The steps that need to be taken by the exporter, the re-exporter, as well as the consignee. And these, are steps that can be taken, within an afternoon. If you authorize something under a license, you have to share the terms and the conditions, with the parties on the license. So there is some, certain similarity between, a license exception STA authorization, as well as the 600 series. But if you're going to use STA as the authorization, and these are the elements that you need to get from the consignee, as well as the steps that need to be kept for the exporter as well as the re-exporter. Next slide. And for the 600 series, in addition to that, you have to fall under 3 ultimate end uses for the STA. Essentially, it's for the ultimate end user that is the U.S. government or government of country and country group A5. For development, production, or servicing of an item for an A5 or for someone that's in the United States. That's ultimately to be used by the U.S. government or government of country and country group A5 or sent to a person in the United States or the U.S. government has otherwise authorized that use. So essentially, if you think of it as a stool, you have to fit under 3 legs of that stool. So you're either sending it outside of the United States, for somebody who's manufacturing something for an A5 government like the UK military, or for coming back to someone in the United States. So you're a defense contractor in the United States, you're sending it to somebody in the UK, could even be your own facility in the UK. They're doing some kind of production process on it. They're going to send it back to you in the United States. STA would be a good one to look to. Or it's part of an otherwise authorized use. So you're sending it to a contractor in France. The aircraft that it's going into, 30 of those aircraft are going to an A5 government, but 3 of those aircraft are going to be going to a non-A5 government, but the State Department or the Commerce Department's already authorized that aircraft to go, that would meet the third leg of STA. The next slide. So additional requirements of the 600 series items only. Non-U.S. parties must have been previously approved on a state or commerce license. And the idea with this is just to make sure that we don't have any, front companies, things like that. What do you do if you're having difficulty in meeting that requirement? That's not a problem. Just apply for an initial license for the first transaction. Once that license gets approved, you don't even need to use the license. Mm-hmm. You don't need to return that license to BIS. Once that license gets approved, then you know you'd meet all of those requirements for all the parties in the transaction being previously approved on a state license or a commerce license. The consignee statement must also address the ultimate end-user restrictions for the 600 series items. As I said, we have a template for the 600 series. You just copy and paste that for the consignee outside the United States, and that would meet that requirement. The end user must agree to an end-use check. Keep in mind that the U.S. government, even if it's an ER99 item, at any time the U.S. government can contact you, whether it goes out under NLR, or it goes out under another license exception, it goes out under STA, or it goes out under a license. The U.S. government may at any time contact a person outside the United States that received that item and say, hey, we'd like to come to your facility to check that out, to make sure that it is actually being used in accordance with the AR. Whether it was authorized under STA, whether it was authorized under another license or license exception, that party has the ability to say no. Now, there may be repercussions from that. We may think that's suspicious and we may put them on the unverified list, but they do have the option to do that. So that element in the end use on the prior consignee statement, all that's doing is acknowledging the prior consignee understands the U.S. government may do that. Some people thought that, if they do that in the prior consignee statement and then subsequently, for whatever reason, they have to say no, that was going to be a violation of the EAR. And that's not the way that we interpret that. And that's an important thing that we're looking to actually clarify in the EAR. There are eligibility requests for certain end items. And these are, certain end items, aircraft, for example, or vessels, where before you could rely on STA, you have to come in and say, hey, I would like to use STA. And we would look at that, and then if the Commerce Department, State Department, Defense Department approved it, then you could use STA, provided that you weren't restricted under 740.2 and you met all the other requirements. Next slide. Okay. And then for the 9X515, these spacecraft-related items, generally all eligible for the A5 ones, but unlike the STA, you don't have those 3 ultimate end uses that you have to go under. So for the spacecraft items in particular, STA is a very good option to use. There are certain exemptions where it is excluded. For example, the software under 9515.B, D, or .E is not eligible for STA. But STA for the spacecraft items in particular is very useful. Next slide. Okay. And this just compares the 600 series and the 9X515, but we want to leave a little bit of time for questions. Next slide. Great. So if you have questions later, we'll address some of the questions here, but you can also send me an email at timothy.mooney, my name was spelled at the beginning, timothy.mooney@bis.doc.gov. My telephone number is 202-482-3371, and then here's some additional contacts in terms of if you have questions. So now we're going to go over some of the questions that we've seen.
Thanks, Tim and Stephen. And just as a quick reminder, folks on the call can press *1 if they want to ask a question over the audio queue.
Okay, and just to go over a couple of the ones that had come in,
please.
The red ones. So please explain the relationship of the Department of Treasury and Commerce. Yeah, so when you're talking about the sanctioned destinations in particular, you always want to make sure that you're looking at the EAR requirements as well as the U.S. Department of Treasury. And each sanctions program is a little bit different. In certain cases, like in Iran, the Treasury Department is the primary licensing agency for the Commerce Department. So in most cases, when an authorization is required, you're going to be looking at the Treasury Department. There are a couple exceptions to that, like with the the entity list, where you might have to get an authorization from the Commerce Department as well as the Treasury Department. In many cases, you're either going to be looking for one or the other. If it involves travel or finance in particular, the Treasury Department might have to get an authorization from them. So each of the sanctions ones, the key thing is, looking at the ER requirements as well as the Treasury Department requirements. In certain cases, you may need an authorization from both. In certain cases, we may defer to one or the other.
That also, when we talk about the Treasury Department, that's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, specifically within the Treasury Department, that is dealing with Iran. Frequently what happens is that OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, will ask a person who's applying for a license, let's say, to Iran, and if it's EAR 99 item, they oftentimes will ask you to get verification from the Bureau of Industry and Security of that designation. And that can be done through our commodity determination. The service that we have is free, in which we can make an official designation. Also within OFAC and their website, there are certain exemptions that they have primarily for medical and humanitarian items, and they have a list of those as well as what they call their general licenses.
Yeah, and this written question, it goes to the example that we gave with Italy. So U.S. origin item is shipped under a license to Italy, the item fails and is re-exported to Germany for repair under TMP and returned under RPL. What documentation is used to document this transaction? Is who is responsible for recording this transaction? So now obviously you're not going to have an AES record for this type of a transaction. The party that's creating the export control documents, they're the ones that's going to be keeping those. So the initial party that received it under the license, when they're shipping it out under TMP, they would document that for their own record-keeping purposes, that they sent this to Germany under TMP. The party in Germany that's doing the repair and the servicing, when they send that back to RPL, any repair records that they're doing, they're creating export control documents, that then they re-exported that back under RPL. So it's the party that's basically using the authorization. Could you please provide the link for the template? Yeah, so if you go on the BS website, there's a link for reform, and then there's a link for ECR teleconference. And if you click on the link for ECR teleconference, you don't go to the ECR teleconference. So you go to the link for reform, and then there's ECR FAQs. And if you click on the ECR FAQs, under license exception STA, there's a question that says, is there a form for the prior consignee statement? And the answer is no. BS did not create a form for the prior consignee statement. However, to assist you, you can link to a template for the 600 series, the 9X515, and then a third template for the other items. And you can simply, and the answer says you can simply copy and paste that onto their letterhead, print that out, and then that would meet the requirements. If you have a production network and you have people in France, Germany, the UK, you can do one single prior consignee statement, and then let's have all the parties that are going to do that sign that prior consignee statement. Another important thing is you don't need STA to authorize a transfer in country. If it went out under a license, you wanted to use STA to authorize the transfer in country, you could. But in general, if it goes to the first defense contractor in the UK and needs to get transferred in country 6 times before it goes to the UK government or before it comes back to the United States, you need that prior consignee statement from the first party, but the additional parties in the chain is being transferred in country to, you don't need that to authorize the additional transfers in country.
Great, thanks, Tim. And let me check in with the operator. Operator, have we had any questions coming over the audio queue?
So far, we've had no one queue up on the audio side. I'll remind them it's star followed by 1. Unmute your phone and record your name. Star 2 will remove your request.
Thanks. We'll give it another minute or two.
Okay. And Steve just wanted me to mention, as we went over the sanction destinations, Cuba, is an example where they are, of course, under a comprehensive trade and investment embargo. But there are a number of license exceptions that are available. Generally, they're very limited in terms of what's authorized, and especially in particular in terms of the sensitivity of the items. For example, the special comprehensive, support for Cuban people, SCP, that's an example of one of our more recent license exceptions for Cuba, that authorizes under very specified criteria, certain ER99 items as well as certain AT-only items. So again, even if it is an embargo country, they're generally going to run into a license requirement generally for all items subject to ER in most cases. But if you look at the Part 746, if you see a specific license exception or a paragraph identified, then you can look at those. And of course, with the sanctioned destinations, if you have any questions, our Foreign Policy Division at 202-482-4252, also as we mentioned on this slide, is available to answer any additional questions that you have. And then often the Treasury Department, as part of that analysis, and the Office of Foreign Assets Control, is always a good idea to check with them also to make sure that you're in accordance with the Treasury Department's controls. So with the license exceptions in particular, we definitely went over a lot of material. The key thing is with license exceptions, when do you look at a license exception, understanding the steps that you go through, and these are very helpful tools in your toolbox. But you want to make sure that you're going to be able to, you're looking at the right license exception, you can meet all of the criteria. You could pick up your lawnmower to cut your bushes, right, but that's not what the lawnmower is designed for. And the same thing with our license exceptions. We create them for a specific purpose. And if there's 6 criteria that you need to meet and 3 exclusions, you need to make sure that you can meet all 6 of those requirements, as well as not being excluded under those 3. Because what we're saying, the U.S. government is 100% of the cases, if you meet that criteria and you're not restricted under 740.2, that we're comfortable with you using that authorization. So they do play a very important role. But again, kind of that example of the live wire, that if you have a license requirement, you just want to make sure that you're staying within the scope of that authorization. That applies whether you're using a license exception, and if you have to go outside of the scope of that, then you're either going to have to come in for a license or come in for another authorization.
Thanks, Tim. And operator, have we had any questions over the queue?
We
Okay.
have one. Aaron Brinkman, your line is open.
Hi, good afternoon. Just one, hopefully, quick question related to Russia and the use of license exceptions for exports from the U.S. to Russia. Supposing we've met all of the other requirements, like we've confirmed that the entity we'd like to send items to in Russia is not subject to sanctions, and the other elements are met, there appear to be limitations on our ability to use license exceptions like TMP imposed in Section 744.21 of the EAR that seem to limit our ability to use exceptions to only license exception GOV. Can you just confirm that that's an accurate read and maybe speak to that briefly?
Okay. So, yes, you actually kind of summed that up pretty nicely. So with Russia is not an embargo destination under the EAR, and as a destination, it's not a country-based sanction. However, with Russia, there are certain sanctions that you do need to take into account, and there has been a lot of activity, the last 3 or 4 years in particular, involving Russia that you would need to take into account. With Russia, you have the Russian industry sector sanctions in 746.5. So you would have to look at that in terms of your analysis. If you trip the license requirements under 746.5, then the only license exception that you would be available to overcome that would be, the United States government authorization. Russia is not a country group D5 country, so in terms of the 600 series, you wouldn't be looking at the D5 paragraph. You'd be looking at the 740.13 A13 paragraph. But obviously, Russia is not in country group A5, so STA, clearly would be off the table for purposes of Russia. Now, in addition to the 746 restrictions that you would see under 740.2A6, 740.2 also talks about restrictions based on prescribed parties or Part 744 end-use controls. And that would be relevant for Russia, and also, although with Russia, with the Crimea region of Ukraine, if the Crimea region of Ukraine, if that was implicated regarding the transaction, you would have to also take that into account, and that also would restrict extremely the use of license exceptions. 744.21 is a military end-use and end-user control. Now, for China, it's limited to a military end-use control for those items that are identified for China. For Russia, as well as Venezuela, it's a broader end-use and end-user control. So if 744.21 was implicated, you'd have a license requirement on 744.21. Then, as the person that submitted the question is correct, you would not be able to use any license exception except for the United States government authorization would be the only one that could overcome that license requirement. So if it was going to the U.S. Embassy, for example, in China, if it was a 600 series item, you could still use in Russia, for example, if a 600 series item going to the U.S. Embassy in Russia, that could still go. Actually, that's not really the best example. But if the only authorization that would be available would be the United States government authorization, would be the only one that could overcome 744.21. The other thing that you'd need to be very careful of with Russia is that there are many Russian entities that are on the entity list. And you would need to make sure that the parties that are involved are not on the entity list, as well as any of the other prescribed parties. Now, being on one list or another as a prescribed party will have a different impact on your transaction. So if they're on the unverified list, that doesn't impose a license requirement necessarily, but it would, you have to do additional due diligence. And if a license was required otherwise for Russia and the party was on the unverified list, then you're not going to be able to use the license exception. There's some additional export clearance requirements that would go along with being on the unverified list. If it was on the Treasury Department's STN list, certain sub-designations under that STN list would also trigger license requirements under the AR. But if they were a Russian entity on the entity list, generally you're not going to be able to use any license exception for that party. So the Russian sanctions program under the EAR, it's not a comprehensive embargo like a Cuba or a Syria, and there is definitely some complexity that goes along with that. So what I would just say, if the transaction does involve Russia, you may be able to use a license exception, but in particular, you just need to make sure that you're very careful in terms of looking at those other license requirements that would also include restrictions on the use of license exceptions. And somebody actually referenced that the templates that I had mentioned, they tried to check on those, and they said the links aren't working. So we'll actually talk with our IT people after this to make sure that those links are working, and if needed, we'll get those fixed this afternoon or tomorrow.
And Tim, what I'll do, I can send a direct link to the template, because you can also reach it by using the search bar on the main BIS website. But I'll make sure to include that link.
Okay,
for
great.
Folks. Operator, any other questions?
There are none at this time. Again, it is *1. Unmute your phone and record your name to join the queue.
If you are wanting further information on license exceptions, or if there are others in your organization that would like to know more about this, we do conduct on a fairly regular basis seminars that are done nationwide. We actually have one coming up tomorrow in Oklahoma City and next month in Atlanta, followed by Louisville and several places on our West Coast office that do address the license exception programs that we have. If they're in our complying with U.S. export regulations courses, it's a component of that two-day course, and if you did want further information on that, it is on the BIS website under the template of compliance and training and current seminar schedule. So we do keep that fairly up to date in terms of the material, especially in the license exception part that is discussed as well. Yeah. And there are also license exceptions, but it's under ITAR. They call it a different word, exceptions, but they also exist under ITAR. But you need to contact the State Department to get a fuller understanding on that area.
Yeah, and if you have suggestions in terms of suggestions for a new license exception, suggestion for adding an additional authorization under an existing license exception, you can send those to us at any time. And with the new administration in particular, a lot of emphasis on trying to streamline and reduce the regulatory burden, where that's warranted. And we have been doing a lot of that the last several years, but that definitely seems like that's going to be a focus. So if you do have suggestions, you definitely at any time you can come in with additional suggestions. A good example of that were the tools of trade provisions for technology, where we had somebody come in with an advisory opinion, and they gave the example. They said, well, if it's going out to our U.S. persons, if they are bringing it to the U.S. person, can we say that that's just not subject to the AR? And they said, well, we think that probably the answer is that is subject to the AR. But if you do come back and say that it is subject to the AR, is there any way that you could expand the tools of trade provisions to authorize certain technology? And the rationale that they gave was, well, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the key tool of trade was the hardware that was going out, or was the software that was going out. But a lot of times now, the key tool of trade for our, U.S. person that's going outside the United States, or our foreign person that's going outside the United States, on behalf of that U.S. company, it's the technology. That's the key tool of trade. So we looked at that and we said, that actually is a good idea. And we had to kind of develop some specific criteria for that to match up with, what we would be comfortable authorizing. But that's an example where somebody, asked a clarification question, and then they said, if this is the way that you're going to come down on it, we suggest that you develop a new type of an authorization, either as a new license exception or as a new authorization under an existing license exception. When we did the license exception changes for the items that moved over, that's another good example where, initially we were thinking, we have much broader license exceptions under the EAR compared to under the ITAR. This is going to be great moving the items over that don't warrant ITAR control. But each time we were doing these proposed rules, people were saying, whoa, slow down. I'm going to lose this ITAR exemption where they're being more permissive under the ITAR for the defense articles versus what we can do under the EAR. And getting that input after the third or fourth rule, we said, well, we do have to take a step back. And then what we did was, ourselves as well as the State Department, we went through and did a table and did each of the EAR license exceptions, each of those different paragraphs, and said, how does this match up with the ITAR? Now, in some cases, they weren't exactly apples to apples, but we tried to say, well, where are there gaps between the two, and where is the ITAR being more permissive? Now, in certain cases, there might have been other ITAR provisions which actually made more sense in the context of the ITAR to be more permissive, but in other cases, we identified areas where we were just being more restrictive. So that was another example where we broadened some of those EAR authorizations to track with the ITAR. So, there is a lot of criteria that goes along with the license exceptions. They're here to help you. They're a very important tool, but don't think of them being set in stone. I mean, they're set in stone at the time that you want to make that export, but if you have a suggestion for how you think that they can be improved, definitely come in and tell those to us. Or if there's, certain criteria that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to you any longer, you can highlight that to us, and we can take a look and see whether the criteria needs to be updated as we go along.
Well, I see that we're right at half past the hour, so Tim and Stephen, I'll thank you again for a very thorough and interesting presentation and for sharing your insights. And thanks to everyone who's on the call. This afternoon we will be sending out the net replay along with a PDF copy of the slides as well as the template that was mentioned earlier. So thank you again and have a great afternoon.
This does conclude today's conference call. Thank you for your participation. Parties may disconnect at this time.